Thank you. Excuse me for following Ed Ludwig's model and speaking professorially ex cathedra, because that's what professors know how to do sometimes. Let me start by trying to answer the question, are we at the beginning of a new Cold War? My answer is no. We are not at the beginning of the new Cold War. We are back to 19th century balance of power politics. And I think this is what we have to understand is happening now before our own eyes. And the reason for that we're not at the beginning of the Cold War is that the Cold War was very unique because it combines two elements. On one hand, great power competition, let's say the Soviet Union, United States, and the Allies, and an ideology. The Soviet Union stood for an ideology, let's say, of world revolution or whatever you want to call it, and the West stood for ideologies. You can call it democracy, you can call it capitalism, but there were ideological elements. Those ideological elements do not appear at the moment. I do not think that anywhere in the jungles of Bolivia or Congo there is a national liberation movement that would like to institute in Bolivia or Congo the model of political system that exists now in Moscow or in Russia. This is not the case. We are into a net world power competition. And the world power competition today seems to be going in the direction of a stronger Russia, not only because Russia appears to be stronger, but because of two kinds of weaknesses of the West. Ed has already spoken about Europe, and I don't want to rub more salt into our European friends' wounds. I mean, some of our best friends are Europeans, obviously, so we should be very careful about that. But the fact is that Europe does not exist as a political or strategic power. And Ed, you mentioned why not appoint Tony Blair. It's a good idea, but the Europeans are not going to appoint a strong person heading either the European Union or in foreign policy department. They're going, as they did in the past, appoint relatively weak. I mean, perhaps the former Prime Minister of Luxembourg is going to be the head of the European Union, but this doesn't really extend a lot of political power externally, with all due respect to Luxembourg. And the United States, under Obama, regardless of his wonderful rhetoric, has shown a weakness of resolve. Very briefly, if the United States or the President of the United States threatens a country like Syria with some punitive military action because it uses poison gas, and then for all kinds of reasons, internal or external, decides not to do it, there is no credibility. To add, after you receive a Nobel Peace Prize for nothing, at the beginning of your presidency, you're never going to use force. And I think in this respect, the Nobel Committee in Oslo knew what they were doing. They were binding Obama's hands very successfully, regardless whether you like it or not. Now, what do we see now happening? And I think one has to realize that on one hand, we see a Russian assertive, if you wish, aggressive policy in the Crimea, no doubt about it. But there were two kinds of aggression in Ukraine and Crimea. There was an aggression at Maidan. I mean, the people at Maidan were not just intellectuals and freedom fighters fighting against a corrupt and authoritarian government. Yes, but there was also violence. If it wouldn't have been violence in Maidan, probably Yanukovych would still be president. There was violence on both sides. And I know this is very difficult to realize because we are looking always for the good guys versus the bad guys, and situations are a little bit complicated. And one of the reasons it's complicated is because politics and world politics does not recognize and does not accept a vacuum. And Ukraine is not exactly a failed state. Ukraine is not exactly a black hole, but the weakness of Ukraine, that after 20 years, after independence, which it gained and was deserving, wasn't able to create a coherent political structure, to bring about a political elite, to unify very disparate parts of the country, meant that Ukraine was very weak as a state structure. We're talking sometimes about a lot of corruption in Ukraine, and we know wherever you have privatization there is corruption, not only in post-communist countries but even in Israel, where we had a little bit of that problem. When you have privatization, it's very easy to find corruption. But why so much in Ukraine? Because historically there was no strong state. There were no political parties. Political parties in Ukraine historically were personalistic parties. Yanukovych, or Yushchenko or Timoshenko, and the same applies to what is happening in Ukraine now. The inability to create a coherent citizenship idea of Ukraine between the West, which has links historically, if you wish, to Poland, even Austro-Hungary, and is very strongly nationalist, and the East, where the links are obviously to Russia linguistically and culturally. So when you have a very weak state not being able to extend effectively its politics, its power internally, and it is mired on all sides with a lot of corruption and lack of legitimacy, you have the sort of situation that brings in external power, and this was used, one can say cynically, but one can also say in terms of realpolitik, very successfully by Russia and by Putin. And I think one of the dangers at the moment, and I'm saying it especially to some of our friends in Poland, let me tell you, I was born in Poland. I just came back yesterday from Poland. The Polish ambassador is here, I think, and tomorrow I'm getting a Polish Freedom Medal, so I'll be very carefully speaking a little bit critically about Poland. Standing up to what was happening in Crimea is clear and justified. However, one should not demonize neither Russian policy nor Putin's policy, even if one criticizes it. This is not 1938 Sudeten. This is not Hitler. This is not Stalin. This is historical Russian autocratic power politics. And the way to stand up to it is by creating alternative structures of power, not just using rhetorics against Russia, and not just making, on the one hand, a demonized Russia, and making Ukraine, which is on the verge of being a failed state, into the model of democracy. Ukraine today is not Czechoslovak democracy in 1938. One has to make distinctions, even if one criticizes Russian policy. Where do we go from here? To my mind, the answer is, this will be a long process. Europe realizing that if it wants to play politics on a strategic level, it has to do the right things in terms of budgetary allocations, in terms of decisions about defense budgetary, in terms of creating the institutions which were established in Maastricht and Lisbon, but then the political leadership in the European countries decided that they prefer a strong German chancellor, a strong French president, never mind the Brits, who are always, the offshore island, and not a strong European institution which can project power. And on the other hand, it will very much depend on what's happening in Ukraine. If the new president will be able to create a coherent state structure, a bureaucracy that works, a judiciary which is independent, local administration which is listening to what people in the West are saying and what people in the East are saying, and not making such mistakes like saying Russia is not going to be an official language even in the East. They have reversed it, but the symbolic nature of that really played into the hand of, let's say, Russian nationalists in the East. So what we would like, what I would like to suggest is to watch not only what Europeans are doing, not only what Russia is doing, but how Ukraine is going to develop. If Ukraine will be able to cohere as a body politic, one can see a Ukraine which is coherent, Western-oriented, and a stabilizing factor. But if Ukraine will continue to be what it has been in the last 20 years, a country where the best friends, Poland, would like to bring it into Europe, which is positive, but there ain't no Ukrainian coherent state that can really live up to the Copenhagen criteria, etc., then we're in for trouble. So the key in the end is how will Ukraine develop. I think we should all wish Ukraine very well, but we should all look at Ukraine with some sort of skepticism and without demonizing Russia, even if we criticize it. Thank you very much.